can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. I'm delighted in this episode to be joined by Matthew Watson. Matthew is a sports coach and esports coaching, or we can get into that, but a performance coach nonetheless, who is currently doing his PhD in esports coaching at the German Sport University in Cologne. Matthew, just firstly, before I get into it a little bit more, just how are you firstly, and thanks so much for getting the time to come and chat to us.
Hi, well, yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and flattering to have some interest in my niche area of work and research. So.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like I've been buzzing to chat to you, I think, because it really does sit within the mission of the podcast to, beyond just obviously try to delve into sort of niche topics as such, I also want to kind of help the wider sports coaching community be more cognizant of just all the different places and spaces in which sports coaching, or we're going to come on the esports coaching exists, and like what an amazing, interesting field this is now that we're in the vocation of video game coaching, and because esports has boomed massively, and it's now paved the way for actually a coaching process being part of that. So this is the first of, I hope, many conversations that I can have across different, niche areas of coaching that really do deserve credibility, and they deserve validation, and actually, selfishly speaking, I want to learn from you. So it'll be interesting today, me being a football coach and you being an esports coach, how we can actually maybe bat off of each other and maybe see where there are similarities and also where there's distinctions. But even in itself, that's really cool. So I think the best place for us to start, because as I say, and I've even caught myself there when I'm introducing you about esports or sports coaching, things like that. But why don't we just start to get into that conversation? Tell us a little, how did you arrive at this point today? Tell us a little bit about that, and also maybe the evolution of esports to the point where we now have coaches operating in that space.
Yeah, great question. A lot to cover. I hesitate to suggest. So my own journey was probably fairly standard to many of your listeners for the first 25 years of my life, in that I played sport growing up. I had ambitions of being a sportsman in basketball, which is fairly interesting, I think, in itself, for being from a small village in the UK. Made the decision to not try and make it over in the States, although teammates of mine did, to differing success levels. But I instead chose to stay in the UK and pursue studies that I thought might one day help me become a basketball coach, or a sort of high performance level coach. So I studied sport and exercise science for 3 years, and I came out of that degree not entirely sure of where I was going, where I would find work, what tangible skills I really had, I think, at that point. It was quite a generalist degree. And so, early 20s, wanted a bit of adventure after having been in the same place for so long. I started going out to summer camp in North America, and I took on an athletics director role there, where I was coaching a lot. And I remember quite distinctly sitting on a picnic bench with an American coach who we were planning our program for the summer. And she said to me, "What's your coaching philosophy?" And I was I was 21 years old, and I really didn't know what she meant. Like, I didn't know why that was a question to ask to help us inform what we're doing with 300 kids in the
Mm.
sun all summer. And that sparked some interest in getting prepared for that answer in subsequent summers, but also like understanding more about like what are the underpinnings here of being a coach and running a coaching program. Um, so I pursued studies to that effect. I did a master's in the Netherlands around sport and physical activity interventions, which allowed me the freedom to sort of explore coaching interventions.
Mm.
A few stints along the way. Ultimately, I ended up pitching a PhD idea in the area of sports coaching at the German Sport University in Cologne, taught in their Institute of Psychology. And the idea at the time was I was fascinated by this idea of a coach as a performer. So I had
Mm.
begun coaching myself, a lot of basketball teams in the Netherlands and in Germany. I experienced firsthand this idea of, wow, we really have to put on a put on a show a little bit as a coach, as well
Mm.
as being the source of all knowledge and all answers and all responsibility. And so I resonated with this idea of coach as a performer, and I thought it would be interesting to study coaching from a psychological perspective to understand and maybe contribute a little bit more to this idea of coach as a performer and provide solutions. So I started a PhD in that area. I looked at things like self-determination theory, trait emotional intelligence, and it was after a few years of sort of struggling, new culture, new language, inherent unwillingness to interrupt coaches to complete questionnaires, especially in a language that
Mm.
wasn't my own, that I realized my research wasn't really moving the needle at all
Mm.
and wasn't really helping in practice. And I think at the same time, around sort of 2017, 18, there was a lot of work coming out about coaching research being quite reductionist and not being super helpful in practice. And I was
Mm.
acutely aware that was like a big driver behind why I wanted to do it in the first place. So, bit of a philosophical crisis for me, and just an interesting set of circumstances where I happened to be working alongside a PhD student in an office, just me and him, and that PhD student was looking at the sort of cognitive performance in esports
Mm.
and sort of high level competitive video games. And he was also working with one of the highest level teams in Europe in a particular game called League of Legends, which is you have
Mm.
5 players. And he spoke to me at length about how he worked with the players, but also he worked with their coaching staff. And the coaching staff had sort of graduated into the role of the coach by virtue of being good at the game.
Mm.
They'd never had
Often the
coach.
case in lots of sports, that is that.
Right,
Ends up
right.
happening.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And he said maybe your work would have some interest to them. Maybe you want to come and talk to them and see if anything sticks and is of interest and can help them as coaches. So in the early summer of 2019, I went over to Berlin. I ran a workshop, and I was a little bit naive to the size of this thing. So I was interested in gaming, but I was very much a suppressed gamer. Like I was living with basketball players during my undergrad, and we had a PlayStation. Like that was, and I enjoyed
Mm.
playing it, but I knew I shouldn't devote time to this. Uh, I have memories of playing with my brother as a kid. I loved it, but it wasn't a serious thing. And then suddenly I was in this world where these coaches were struggling with how to best teach players to be better at the game and to work together.
Mm.
And I threw a few things at them: self-determination theory, self-reflection, a few ideas like that. And some of it worked, some of it I think was interesting. A lot of it was sort of unrealistic in a sense because it just didn't work like that in their world.
Mm.
And that's kind of what got me thinking. There was no research at the time, zero research around what it takes to be an esports coach or a good esports coach at that. And I sort of went through the process of talking to various of like mentors, supervisors at the German Sport University, whether I could make that a focus of my PhD, thinking that might have more impact.
Mm.
And they were fully behind it. And yeah, it's been a journey, but it's still ongoing. However, I'm now sort of little bit clearer on the studies I'm doing, the research I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and the impact it might have. So,
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean that's tremendous, and it's quite cool to kind of see how you've kind of stumbled on it almost as well. But
right.
and again, kind of coach to coach, I totally take that point around the. I mean, there's always has been a bit of a reductionist view within academia, I suppose, within sort of coaching, articles, the literature around coaching, and what I found quite refreshing, actually, I mean, when we'll come to this, I suppose, there was a wee bit of a prelude to the fact that you actually wrote a 2000 an article in 2022 around what esports coaching was, and what I quite enjoyed by it, and where I always think it often ticks a very important box, is there was a sort of a sociological focus within the psychology conversation there. So it was, touching on some of the tensions, and again, importantly, I think positioning that coach as the performer is so vital because I mean, I actually just recently done an interview with Richard Husseini on this kind of very topic because there's so many pressures attached to coaching and so much posturing in coaching and so much, impression management, and it's managing up, down, sideways.
Yeah.
There's so many elements to it that makes it very difficult, and then it's often polluted and almost by a lot of other sort of agendas, commercial agendas, and what I think, and this is just one of the benefits, and what I'm really intrigued to kind of hear about today, and we will, maybe this is jumping a bit ahead, but we'll come to it eventually, is how actually an esports coach exists within such a commercialized, technological world.
Yeah.
Like video game industry is massive. Like the money in it is just insane. So like that in its sense as well. Like any sort of profitable activity that esports has became as well as a sort of, you know, element franchise to that sort of world. I don't know what you might call it. The coaches then part of that, and then the fact then the coaches get pressures within that space. There's so much that can be learned about how you, me as a coach, or a football coach, can what I could take from someone like yourself and the coaches you've worked with, Matt. So I'm quite looking forward to getting into that. I think I just know it'll be very difficult for the coaches, and I'm sure you know that better than anyone. So why don't we? I think a nice starting point to this is that this kind of leads into the article, I think, and then
Mhm.
you can tell me, and you lead the conversation, Matt. But I kind of want to know. Let's get into the sort of tongue twister of exactly how to position esports coaching to start with. Okay, cool. So you can tell me if you maybe want to talk about the distinctions between esports coaching and coaching before we get into actually what the far more similarities and some of the far more interesting areas that I think we can then, learn from coaches of maybe more mainstream sports. So why don't we start there? What is esports coaching? What is esports coaching not? Because I
Yeah.
know that was quite an important sort of precursor to some of these conversations.
Yeah, definitely. So esports, I think many of your listeners will have heard of esports probably, and you actually nailed it there by the gaming industry. So video games are massive, billions of
Mm,
players, lots of different games, and within that industry is the esports industry. So you have you have games that are played casually, and people might have that in the form of a mobile app. They might have it in the form of a console game, or they might have a PC game that they play, and they just dip in and out of it for fun.
mm,
That is a huge worldwide thing. Within that is this esports industry, and depending on what definition you go off, a generally accepted academic definition is that esports is the sort of competitive play of certain video games within structured and organized competitions. Um, and so within that, you have the people that own the game. So you have game publishers who produce this software, which is the game, and they give the rights to people to run leagues and to run tournaments. And then within that, teams set up to compete. And to do so, they recruit some players, and they often, increasingly over the last 10 years, have recruited coaches to support those players.
mm,
But it's not that is similar to the high performance model in sport, but
mm,
it's the pillars of it, the foundations of it are different because the players, and we had to do with colleagues. I did a different qualitative study to sort of get to this idea, but players don't necessarily start out being encouraged to pick up games at a young age and enter into what I might call coached environments. So they aren't encouraged at 6, 7, 8 years old to join a team and to work with a coach and to, learn the basic skills involved in a video game. They they tend to play the game for fun with friends by themselves after hours. So after school, for example, they might get home and jump onto a game and connect with friends or siblings, and they might play a lot. They might experience some success. It
Mm-hmm.
might open new doors to them. For example, often professional players talk about having that one experience as a young teenager where they played the game they loved and they got invited to go with a team to a tournament in another town, and that was really exciting. And all of this is done without mention of a coach. And then
Mm.
eventually they get very good, and their their skill it shows up on various websites in the form of a rank, and that
Mm.
rank is promoted and pushed. And these teams that have formed and that have coaching staff attached will look at these ranking ladders, these ranking boards, and they'll say, well, this player is very good, he's in a region, or this player, he, she, for example, and
Mm-hmm.
they are good enough for the level at which we're competing. And we reach out to them and try and find an agreement for them to play for us. But this might be mid-teens, might be late teens, might be early 20s.
Mm.
And the player will enter into a team and for the first time start working with a coach. And so knowing this, it was interesting to me to think, well, first of all, how does that influence our ability to coach players if they've spent so long developing their skills without any coaching?
Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, where do the coaches come from? And so
Mm.
just to attempt to string this back to the question, my PhD, essentially, I realized I had to take a step back. There wasn't a questionnaire here that would capture would get me these answers. I had to take a step back.
Mm.
I had to leave sort of quantitative behind and go into qualitative and start exploring what's going on and the different stories within that. And so the 2022 paper was very much trying to understand, where do the coaches come from? How do they make these decisions? What do they do? What's their backstory?
Mm.
Um, and yeah, what are the successes, the tensions, their methods that are used in practice? So that was I don't know if that's a coherent answer, but within that,
Yeah,
you can kind
yeah,
of, yeah, see where I'm
yeah,
coming from.
yeah, and I suppose, because I mean, I suppose just for a wee bit of context for the people that are listening as well. So what you actually went and done is you interviewed, I think, 14 head coaches, wasn't it, Matt?
Mhm.
And this was of sort of pro esport teams. And I suppose let's like kind of sticking on how we can distinguish esports coaching as its own sort of thing, but also how we can then bring it into the coaching world, the sport coaching world, as a sort of at the very least a very close cousin,
Yeah.
and why I think that, are a sibling of some sort, because the way, and you can, and I'm keen for you to help me kind of understand these distinctions. I suppose where I see the one distinction is that with sort of mainstream sport coaching as such, it's the sports itself are quite fundamental and they don't necessarily change, and it's quite, basketball's universal, badminton's a universal sport, it doesn't change, and if it does change, it changes all at once. Whereas, with video games, there's games that are changing, so there's never necessarily a consistent sport as such. So I don't know if that kind of helps maybe help with the boundaries of it, but and I don't want to actually stick too much on that because I don't actually think that's certainly not the purpose of this conversation. I think it's actually about us really understanding what we can learn from esports and where it has got the commonality because it is so esports coaching, sorry. Because you mentioned all the things there, and what I was quite intrigued and what I found really interesting when I read your paper, which I will link in the description to this episode if I really want other people to look at it too, because it really blew me away insofar as just understanding that, look, you've got these really talented gamers, but there's one thing being effective, but there's another thing optimizing performance, and that's what the coaches want to do. They want to optimize performance, and certainly within competitive spaces. And then I started to then sort of look at some of the realities that you very succinctly were able to actually illustrate in your work. But the reality is being that maybe across a full season, there's commitment that can go up and down. There's within the game space itself, the idea of cohesion amongst team members. I found, and again, we'll jump between stuff here because some of your findings, I mean, the tactical aspect I found
Yeah,
fascinating. We'll talk about, and look, I'll probably butcher the terminology here, but things like metas, like where there's updates to games, there's patches that are
yeah,
equivalent to basically new tactical trends coming in that coaches need to continuously evolve within. I actually
yeah,
think, to be honest, the landscape's probably changing at a faster rate in gaming than it probably does in football, for example. Like things change occurs, and obviously no game's ever the same, but in terms of the actual capabilities and the general things about what can be expected, that doesn't come along as quickly as what I imagine these, patches and updates to games and characters and things like that. And then so then as a coach, you need to be reactive to that all the time. And you need to somehow at the same time develop a sort of a long-term development plan while
yeah.
still being able to prepare and adjust. I mean, that sounds mental. Like
Absolutely. Yeah,
that sounds really, and I think, and then you consider all the other aspects about how teammates get together, the pressures of performing. I think some of the other stuff that I found really interesting, and this is something again that's really one of the things we spoke about off air, and forgive me, I know I'm jumping about between things. We'll come back to something and we'll work our way through it. But even the very fact that, I mean, I've had conversations recently with Colin Cronin on the podcast where we spoke about, the way that sports coaching is moving in a direction that's extremely formulaic and very led by a sports science narrative, and now is starting to be and will be certainly in the future led by more technology in the way
mm,
that things are advancing. And there's that risk now about how we can go along for the ride with that, but without dehumanizing the player. And again, like if we want some sort of reference point here about how coaches might work within that space. Esports coaching is literally in a digital world. It's
yeah,
literally inside the space that we know. All the things that I'm worrying about right now for the more mainstream sports coaching is happening already. You can't. It never was any different because it was all and you have to. And that's another thing that esports coaches need to handle. So we can get into a lot of that. But I think it's maybe tell me if that's speaking to how you're thinking about any of that. But just in terms of these similarities, because that's what I think is really important for us to understand right now.
yeah. 100%. There's so much there, I think, that is of interest, and the the basic technological constraints of coaching in esports are forcing a lot of what we might look at as innovation. Maybe in some cases it's suboptimal coaching. In some cases it's innovative and brilliant coaching. But at its core, these games are they're technological. Well, it's software, and
Mm,
there are limits to what the software allows you to do. So the easy comparison is, and it might not, it doesn't align with every sort of coaching philosophy, but if you have a football field and some cones, you can, within the laws of physics, you can move those cones anywhere and ask players to engage in this, that, and the other sort of activity within a specific game, like League of Legends.
hmm
The publisher controls how that game works, and there are things you can do and things you can't do. And there isn't the general consensus amongst players is there isn't really a practice tool that is really very, very good because
mm,
the games are so complex. So you play the same map, right? It's a map, but you could consider that to be the court, for example. So you play the same court, yes, but you are not representing yourself as a player in that arena. You are
mm,
operating a digital avatar called a champion,
mm,
and there are 168 different champions, I think, at present, and they have different abilities. So you're and you get your team gets to pick five of them, and each time there might be a different constellation of champions, and so there's a lot of moving factors there. But you play the game out, and there are different resources in the game that give you um, different sort of abilities and different sort of momentum boosts in the game, things like that. And the complexity of the game is fantastic, is huge. And to be able to replicate one scenario later in a game in a practice environment is almost impossible. So there isn't a tool available that really allows you to recreate a situation that you might want to improve. But also there isn't really a possibility to rehearse a situation in the same way you might rehearse a set play, because the games are so complex, and something that the exact constellation of scenario of instances that make up a situation you might want to work on as a coach is unlikely to ever come up in that same way ever again. It's not the same as working on a corner in football, for example. So you could tell your player, start on the edge of the box, I want you to, run towards the near post, like that. Being able to have that sort of certainty about a situation that will come up is very unlikely. And so coaches are constrained by that. They have to find ways of preparing players to still execute a strategy, a tactical plan, like a set of tactics, a strategic plan, not knowing if that situation will ever come up, or if it comes up, it won't be exactly the same, and there will be nuances based on the type of abilities that the champion you're playing has. So coaches are hedging their bets in many ways about what to work on.
So that was the thing. So this was the thing I was trying to figure out in my mind as well, because, and pardon the pun here, but because my initially what I was considering an esport game to be like would be, is it a mind game? Is it? But then it isn't quite that. I know that, like as you say, you present a digital avatar, and therefore it sounds almost like physical movement that we would associate with sort of being what the target of motor learning techniques would be within coaching, as if that wouldn't necessarily be there. But there is actually physical movement. It's like fine motor skills, in terms of, but an esports athlete will use a joystick or a controller pad and that sort of thing. And I was trying to wrestle with what is the sort of, and you don't need to have an answer to this, but it's just might be quite fun to speculate on, because what is the sort of, is it, and I know it might change, and it's a very personal thing, to be fair, to different coaches or organisations, about how what their sort of guiding philosophy is of how they equip players to handle these different scenarios. But I was going back between, is it more information process led, of this, as far as having a memory component, if people are playing these games endlessly, can they start to develop trends? But then we've kind of touched on that these trends only last for so long. Or is it actually, and I think you kind of mentioned, you were talking about the constraints coaches work within, is there actually a bit of an ecological model within that, actually, in the way that players need to learn how to find these affordances, to find movement solution? And again, movement, we are talking in this very morphed way. It's very transcendent of physical movement, but also digital, interaction with the environment. And it's almost like, what do you think? Which of them do you think speaks more to how maybe an esports coach is preparing people? Because constraint-led coaching is a very popularised thing. We see it there. Is that actually more aligned with the esports coach, or is it maybe a more dominant view, but this has been memory led? What's your kind of take on that from your experience?
It is fascinating to really think about the ecological dynamics and information processing discussions. It is really interesting to apply that to esports, because especially in League of Legends, if you ask players about the potential to do a drill where you isolate an aspect of a game, they will sometimes do that, but they will tend to see it as just a warm up for those fine motor skills. So they might, there is an option where they can isolate their champion in a certain area of the map and execute abilities against a dummy, and they might do that, but they recognize that that's a warm up, so that gets them maybe psychologically, but also like certainly mechanically, like with their fine motor muscles, that gets them warmed up. They would never use that as a way of really practicing. So the most, what people consider the most viable way of training, especially in League of Legends at present, is to play full games. And it's almost, I mean, you couldn't get more representative than that, really, except some of the performance pressures. But people have to, in a way, they're forced to play full games. And as a consequence, and what we found in my paper, or our paper with my co-authors, was that if that's the most viable option at present, the most viable, or the most applicable pedagogy, coaching pedagogy, is this review process. So to go through
Mm.
that cycle of play a game, review the game, plan for the next game, with the caveat that we can't be confident that our plans will be relevant in the next game because it could be a completely different set of circumstances.
Mm.
And they do this for the majority of their practice time in a week. So coaches have to they watch the team play and they will make notes. And then what's interesting about League of Legends and some of the games is that the coach can't interact with the team whilst the game is being played. They
Mm.
in a training environment they could pause the game. They could ask players to pause. However, it's generally not seen as the done thing.
But in a live competition, there's no opportunity for that interplay as such. So they need to be very equipped, I'd imagine, to be independent and
Yes.
to do that. Okay, yeah, I'd imagine that must be really. So there's a couple of things there. That must be quite challenging if you can only ever use the full, what you might call the parent game, or the sort of the game in its most full form.
Yes. Yeah.
Because one of the things I suppose that we raided by in football was we can compartmentalize the parent game because we can chunk it up and at least during practice we don't need to have just the full format of everything happening all at once, where in the moments it's sometimes coincidental if athletes then actually practice or get opportunities to do the things you want them to practice and do. So we can do like 2v1s and rondos and do like small sided game equivalents. But if you're not able to do that in esports, you have to, I could imagine, what's the, and maybe for other coaches of similar sports or sort of situations where it's a similar sort of thing, how do you kind of bypass that then? How do you still manage to conjure information from that that you can use? Is it purely data led then? Does it become more about using the numbers? And how do you decipher that? Because I'd imagine a lot, because I know a lot of coaches that if they do need to handle numbers more often, how they make sense of that, how they communicate that is always a challenge. And I wonder if there's any insights that you might be able to give that help coaches maybe, strategize a bit better with that, execute those sort of, review sessions a bit better. Well, did any of that align with how the reality is that you face? I just wonder.
Yeah, I'm I have a lot of unknowns myself, so I'm by no means a fountain of solutions
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to how to effectively coach in esports. However, there is a lot of the coaches we've spoken to over the years talk about fixing mistakes. So they
Mm.
review games and they look for example, when your champion was killed in an interaction with an opponent, they will review that situation to try and understand why it happened and what you might want to do differently next time.
Mm.
You might look at statistics in the sense of you can earn you can earn gold by
Mm.
doing things well to buy resources which will better help your team. And you can look at points where that really escalated in favor of the other team. And you
Mm.
can try and understand why that might happen. And some high level coaches I've spoken to, they use things like decision trees. So they try and
Okay.
work backwards. So
Yeah.
this scenario here, the game was almost out of control. Can we come back to, 5 instances before where maybe a decision was made that maybe spiraled into the later situation? I have seen that used, but there's always it's an interesting point because you have 5 players who play essentially 5 different roles, and they will have certain champions that they are very comfortable on, that they play a lot in their free time to get better at, and they might see things differently from other players, and
Mm.
the coach might not be so familiar with the champions they prefer to play, and there is this tension in the industry about at present, it's sort of the feeling that the coach needs to be the have all the answers and to have the highest level of game knowledge.
Mm.
However, when you really apply that in practice, it's impossible. It's impossible for the coach to be have the highest level of game knowledge for every individual champion and every constellation of champions that the team might play to be able to review a single game and then work it back to the point at which things got out of control or things got out of
Mm.
hand. So in
Mm.
those moments, I found that the coaches that have been the most effective have been the ones that there are maybe principles that you can apply to a game, strategic principles, and coaches can understand those at a high abstract level, and they have maybe an understanding of some champions, but not to the level of the individual player who practices that role
Mm,
for hours a day.
mm,
But the most effective coaches in that scenario are the ones that are just the best facilitators of conversation and dialogue and finding solution.
mm, mm.
Uh, yeah,
So I would, yeah, I was actually about to say, does that then, because it makes me think, so certainly what happens, there's always that scenario or that sort of debate in football in terms of when a manager comes in, do they, uh, recruit players according to their own philosophy and their own way, and I suppose what their sort of understanding and their knowledge base, so that they don't kind of push outside of that too much to a space where they aren't as equipped to handle it, or do they actually kind of negotiate and help the team and the players they've got create a sort of format or a formation or a style of play that suits the individuals, and that must be quite tough then, I suppose, where or maybe again, maybe it's just the same, but it just comes down to recruitment. I could imagine the recruitment process must be quite, is it if it is complicated, I mean there must be a massive pool of talent in some
mm,
sense that coaches can pull from, but then understanding what actually differentiates them. I can imagine that's quite a that in itself is a bit of an Rubik's cube, because it might be too late come the point when people are in to really understand name. And is it really about understanding name not as a player or as a performer, but as the who's the person that's actually
that's it.
operating
Yeah,
the avatar? Because that's the personality aspect that isn't probably as simple, I'd imagine, as just plugging in players who are all very good at something. This is still people behind the avatars that have got their own personalities, isn't it? So
100%.
what do coaches typically do? How do they handle that in that space, I suppose, interpersonally?
Well, you've articulated the one of the main problems or challenges perfectly. So everything up until maybe the highest echelons of esports competition, where teams
Mm-hmm.
do often train in person and together, and they might even live together and things like that. But recruiting talent, you're recruiting from a global pool of players often,
Mm-hmm.
and you all you know about them is what you see on screen. So you might there are restraints on at the highest level on sort of how many different nationalities you can have in a team, and sometimes there have to be a certain amount of like home nationality per team. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, in theory, you're recruiting from a global talent pool, and what you have available to you is the game rank, and
Mm-hmm.
that comes from a mode of the game where it's not in sort of structured team environment. That comes from individual play, where you jump on and play the game often with a random group. So people play a high volume of games as frequently as they possibly can, and they try and accrue enough wins to move up the ladder board, the rankings. But that you see these numbers, you see the statistics. You might sometimes be able to see video of games that they've played,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't see them, you don't hear them, you
Mm-hmm.
don't see their interactions in the game with teammates. You don't see what their lifestyle is like. You don't see whether they
Mm-hmm.
are in a good spot and ready to make the jump into a team environment and commit to an organized practice schedule. So the recruitment is extremely difficult. And not only that, you're then working within the constraints of it being um, quite a commercial space. So your
Mm-hmm.
team is incentivized to make money or produce attractive content to get eyeballs. And you have to make all sorts of judgments as a coach about who's going to be the best fit for your team, your team's goals, for you. And you could probably
Mm-hmm.
judge play style is possibly one thing you can judge, but
Mm-hmm.
you're making an assumption about their fit with other players, and
Mm-hmm.
you're also competing. Like the window at time in which you sign talent is often quite pressured, and you're competing with other teams around the world. And if you're not quick to make a decision about a high-ranking player, then someone else might get them, and
Mm-hmm. That
you
must,
are yeah.
yeah, just that must be the juggling act there. I can see must be. You've got the need to help with sort of team cohesion, and maybe we can speak about that, but maybe in further detail. There was anything that you maybe gleaned from the coaches around that space, but you're trying to assist with this. You're also to say there's a commercial pressure, not just to win, but also to don't know, like get clicks or get following,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
social
Yeah.
media. I mean,
Yeah.
you see that now with loads of sports clubs, loads of teams. That players aren't just players; they're brands now. They're like faces of companies. So it's
Hmm.
like, and I could imagine like the scheduling aspect must be quite tough because you're probably in some way trying to actually space off time for practice in just a general sense is one thing, to then actually having to kind of put on these sort of circus shows of, I don't know, like you've got like Twitch and things like that, and you know, where they're actually now being asked to do things that isn't really helping yours. It could help to some degree, I suppose. It just depends how you manage it. But these are all things I suppose all coaches need to handle at that elite level, and I just see it again being quite magnified here, and perhaps making it even more challenging is that outside of, I mean, how often do you get camps that are, you know, people are physically together, versus where there's sort of a need to coach remotely, because that is also a space, you know, endurance sports, there's a lot of remote coaching now that
Right.
occurs there, and I just wonder, you know, that what's your experience been, either yourself personally as an esports coach, but also maybe the coaches you've worked with, about actually coaching across long distances, to then also managing in probably a short, quite episodic
Yeah.
space of time where they are together, to then also, you know, make that gel and work, because it's again quite interesting. It's different people who work differently at different times. So yeah, what would you say to some of that?
Yeah. I have huge sympathy. So I've I haven't coached a game in terms of the game specific
Hmm.
knowledge. But I've worked on staff with a number of teams and worked quite closely with the coaches and the players. And I have enormous sympathy for the head coach of these teams, especially not at the top level, but everything underneath it, where the teams are probably they probably don't have the budget for much in person,
Mm,
if anything. So they are
mm,
primarily remote and online. And I have immense sympathy for the coaches in those situations, because what emerged in my 2022 study, but also in later work, has been that what to build the sort of interpersonal relationships within the team whilst being physically remote is difficult, but also being generally isolated to or constrained within the time at which you are together and training,
mm,
it's hugely difficult, because actually what players might jump on. They might have a pre-training chat about what their goals are for the day. They engage in the training, and remember, the coach can't speak during the actual gameplay, so the coach might have
mm,
their 15-minute time period to sort of facilitate conversation and chat. And at the end of
mm,
the day, everyone logs off, and
mm,
it's so sharp. It's online, offline at the click of a button.
mm,
And what I
mm,
felt has been missing is downtime, corridor conversations, I suppose they talk about in sports psychology quite a lot. And building relationships is very, very hard, because it's difficult just to chat and catch up when you're all on the
yeah,
same voice channel.
yeah,
You can't just pull someone to a side. You're all there in the group. You're online, you click a button, you're offline, very little downtime. It's all constructive when you're together, well, supposedly constructive. And equally, you don't often see people. So a lot of the devices we use, I've worked with a number of players who had limited ports. So a webcam wasn't an option. It was microphone and screen
mm,
sharing. That was it. So I've worked with players who I've never seen their face other than an image, because
mm,
they are just on the mic, and they can hear and speak, but there is very little sort of non-verbal communication going on, and
mm,
you have to make a judgment based on how frequently they input, what they say, the tonality they use, and
mm,
and the coach is trying to do that with five players, be conscious of
mm,
themselves. The, the impression management is if I'm quiet and not saying anything, do the players think I'm making judgments, or do I need to just keep
mm,
talking to fill the space to make them feel supported? And how do
mm,
I put across appropriate levels of challenge without knowing how it's being received?
mm.
Hugely difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, one of the things straight away that's going to be very hard to accommodate there, and that I use, I find, and I place a like great importance on this, is the corridor chats, or you know, and I suppose that's one thing I always say as coaches, we need to maybe not always place so much importance on the bid talks that always come before practice or during a game or after. I always think it's actually like to connect with players, it's an individual thing sometimes, and pulling a kid or pulling an athlete, a senior player, whatever, just to decide, just even for something, not doesn't even need to be necessarily linked explicitly to their performance, but just to connect with them and say, how are you and how's things
Yeah.
and how's life? That is missing in some ways, I suppose. So that I could imagine they need to be quite creative about how, if there's separate online chats as such. I suppose it also sort of speaks to the importance of I don't know if linguistics is the correct words, but where you're in the absence of maybe visual confirmation on feelings and how people are actually managing, and just having the emotional intelligence perhaps or the ability to detect uh, meaning in pauses between speech, or to detect the tone of voice, or to detect where there is just the lack of voice. And again, managing team coherence and those sorts of things is quite contingent, therefore, on understanding the relationships between people. So there's a lot of different levels of challenge I could imagine it's kind of happen simultaneously there. I kind of want to dip into the idea of sort of decision trees that you'd mentioned earlier. So, because I wonder what we can maybe learn around the sort of autonomy supportive aspect of this.
Hmm.
If we know that the coaches, what it reminds me a wee bit of kind of rugby in a way, because rugby, you'll notice oftentimes if you watch like rugby games, like the head coach and the coaching staff, they're quite separated from the athletes during performance. Like often they'll at least are in the stands. It's a bit of a cultural thing, and to be fair, they have some links through like water boys who can pass on certain messaging, but it's still very minimal.
Yeah.
So um, I just wonder what are some of the sort of practices around helping equip athletes to manage independent of the coach, if there is a real lacking, or perhaps that's what they're just the general disposition of maybe the average athlete is, because they do come into it solo. So maybe that's about just leaning into that further, but maybe the word of advice just before, or these sorts of things. But how do they manage that? And then also, I suppose, as part of that, there's probably a bit of a necessity for player input, because you did talk a little bit in your article about the autonomy support that's
Yeah.
provided and what maybe we can kind of take from that. So if you want to speak to that, it'd be amazing, Matt.
Certainly. So this is where I feel sports coaching researchers and sports coach developers would be welcomed with open arms in the esports space,
Mm,
because with limited channels for communication, there's probably no consensus on the most effective way to help players jump on board with a strategy for an upcoming game. And there are minimal ways that the coach can really impact that. You have a lot of text channels in the social sort of the platforms in which players
hmm
speak, or the team speaks prior to a game. So if we talk about mainly remote teams here, you might think about all the creative ways a coach could summarize sort of thinking points ahead of or key action points ahead of a game. So maybe there are certain phases to these games, but maybe it's a couple of bullet points about reminding the team what kind of champions that they wish to pick going into a game
mm,
based on some sort of some scouting they've done about the opponent and their strengths,
hmm
their perceived strengths and weaknesses. So you can see coaches might pin a message in a chat with the bullet points to remind them.
hmm
They have an opportunity sometimes to have a quick summary once the team knows what champions are being played by them and against them. There is an opportunity there to summarize and focus and frame what's coming up.
hmm
But it's difficult, and you have a limited time window in which to do these things, and players will have new ideas in the moment. And so you can
mm,
come in with a game plan. It might be rocked a little bit by the constellation of champions being played, and a player might have a really, really good idea. And how do you uncover that and agree consensus within sometimes a 2 minute window prior to game
mm,
starting? So
mm,
that's where I think coach developers in sport would be welcome, because there are probably abstract levels of of developing strategy and embedding it in the team's play that maybe haven't been utilized all that
Mm,
much.
mm,
Um, you know, you could theoretically ask the players to have pin a post-it note on the frame of their monitor
mm,
to remind them of certain things. And maybe at the highest level, when players are in person, you see that. You see prompts in the training environment, like a whiteboard with the focus for a week of training on the wall, for
mm,
example. But
mm,
it's not much more than that at this point, and
mm.
there are constraints. So, as I said, the coach can't interact with the players. But back to the autonomy question, um, I think the best teams I've been part of have tried to build that, yeah, working from the self-determination theory playbook here, tried to build that cohesion by giving players space outside of the game to learn a bit about each other and each other's
Mm,
preferences and personalities too. So, for
mm,
example, just by having within a training block, so a block of games that they might play, having a player lead a review session instead of the coach. So the player decides what are the talking points I think are most important to touch on. How can I ask questions to gain understanding of the team's view of that? And in that same breath, giving that player the chance to maybe develop leadership skills. So
oh, okay. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that that is a nice thing to do, and
Mm,
it gives the coaches maybe a refreshing moment to think about to gather information about how someone else sees the game, which can then
yeah. It's very,
align with that.
it's
Yeah.
pretty interesting with that actually, because it makes me think about we often, I suppose, and this is, I'm not trying to speak from my whole sport by any stretch of imagination, but we'd often sometimes think of cohesion is something that's taught and something that the coach um, leads in the cultivation of that and the fostering of that. But if you actually think about it in the way that I think I'm learning from the esports sort of conundrum, is it cohesion sort of experience. So you're kind of showing a space where the players need to be empowered to learn from one another, but to guide that conversation a bit more
Yes.
organically, because I don't think necessarily the coach, I don't think it's enough actually, perhaps, and you probably maybe gleaned this as well from, you'll know much more than me insofar as the esports place, but again, speaking more just generally here about coaching, I don't think it's enough just having the tactics board up and telling the players about what our cohesion looks like, and
Right.
because it has to be experienced. They have to learn each other's personalities, not just what they're meant to do. It's
Yeah.
There's a difference in what an athlete, what your teammates meant to do, and what they end up doing, and I suppose it becomes anticipatory, doesn't it? So the better players are able to anticipate each other's um, decisions, and that comes from the close relationships that they can build with them. So it's teaching me a little bit, I think, about the importance of there's a tactical and there's a performance orientated premise to actually just helping players spend more time with one another, and maybe that's where practice spaces can be orientated in that respect, so that there isn't there'll be probably an underlying or an overarching sort of focus that the coach is looking at, but in some sense, the fact that the coach can't interact when the game starts, maybe that's not actually a bad thing, and but then it's just as long as they can expertly manage the time between that and the
Hmm.
breaks, and how they sort of review the moments, maybe.
It is. I fully agree. The caveat being, it's probably a bad thing where in my 2022 paper, coaches spoke a lot about having to fix mistakes.
No, well,
So
yeah,
that's where the
okay.
coaches sort of feel like they take back the
Mm,
control.
mm,
But exactly as you're saying, if the coach decides it's on me to fix mistakes, you're not necessarily empowering the player to fix their own mistakes in the game when the coach isn't around.
yeah,
So
yeah. Makes you think as well. It comes back to that, and I think I last spoke to this about this to Kevin Nichol in another episode. But it's like, can we ever really be a Tony supporter then? Because like ultimately, it's about trying to get them to do what the coach wants. So it's almost a bit of a con, but it does ask that question around that, and then yeah, how you sort of manage that. I mean, one of the other things I was quite interested in is, and this I think shows the sort of I don't know if multidisciplinary nature is maybe the correct word, but the fact that the coaches need and the esports coach needs to sort of if you might call it delegation, I don't know, but leading on the sort of performance analysis metrics, I think that to me was quite interesting, because I wonder that if that's used to inform the coaching of the players, there's probably a real challenge there that I think's experienced across sports as well, is how do you feed players information that's number based without it becoming an obsession to the players? Because numbers
Yeah.
don't always tell the fullest picture. And I think what esports coaching offers a really stark, radical picture of that I think we can use as a really nice reference point for solving this problem in a smaller way, perhaps in other sports, is that the global rank, it's all public rankings. That's, players are vulnerable to that. Like that's,
Yes.
I could only imagine, like that's your performance on complete public, observation, and that in a bit in numbers as well. It's a heightened way of doing that. So, but if that's also the tools that coaches use, and we see this in all sports now, it's analytics are massive. It's trying to get that tension correct between listen to the numbers, but how do you get not drawn into the numbers? Because I suppose it's, and this is what I think it's just, again, I think it's a challenge that particularly where coaches are operating in performance oriented spaces where it's almost like a zero sum, you need to win. That leads itself to outcome goals. But if we want to actually develop players and athletes, we have to have process within that. But if your main analytical tool is as an outcome, it's very difficult to to keep those different voices of get better and improve yourself, but also be the best already that we need you. That's very difficult to manage.
Yeah.
I mean, does that speak to anything of I suppose your insights on the paper?
So much, especially the this constant performance outcome evaluation that permeates the industry. In fact,
Mm,
so much so, just an interesting insight would be that many players at the highest level will have secondary, even more accounts to play the game under a different name, so they can play with a little bit more freedom and be a bit more
oh, yeah,
exploratory without
yeah.
hoping that no one can identify them by their pool of champions and play style. And it just allows them a little bit of more time to play and study and learn, which is really hard to come by in the space where everything is evaluated, everything is available
Mm,
online, and everyone judges and sees everything all the time. So
mm,
it's so entwined with the technology and the internet that it's hard to sometimes escape the results.
mm,
And even to identify, there are so many statistics that you can judge performance by. The things that is quite overwhelming at times. I've seen interesting
mm,
approaches where teams often have some connection to an analyst of some kind, and I've seen interesting systems where, for example, in a spreadsheet, they might collect data and they might use comparisons with players within the same league, and they might use a traffic light system to highlight to players where they are on certain metrics in comparison to others in the league. So green would be above, yellow would be on par with, red would be below, and then they use those as just a way of just stimulating discussion with the player
mm,
to say like which of these statistics is relevant for you, do you feel, and where could we hope to get it to within the course of the season. But then it comes against this barrier that the certain champion that a player might be asked to play in a game might have a slightly different function. So there are statistics which don't necessarily apply across the board for every role of player. But yeah, it's very hard to get away from the outcome focus because for many years, I think even today, still there is a criticism about short termism in the industry.
mm,
So there, on the outside, it seems like there's a lot of money in esports, and yet contracts are very short. And
mm,
at the highest level in some of the major games, players earn a significant amount of money, six figures and a high six figures too. However, you come off that top level and it drops off dramatically,
mm,
and your contract might be for it might be for half a year, might be for a year. Um, Within that year, you might have the opportunity to play in a competitive season, which only lasts 3 months, and you could be dropped after 3 months, and that could be your year done, and you've got to get back to creating or raising your game rank to be publicly visible to future teams. And the coaches, I think, are even they don't have a game rank to prove their knowledge. They have the word of mouth of players, and the players at the moment are often, they are in a position where they have to win to prove their worth because of it's hard to access the other things we spoke about earlier, like the communication within a team. It's hard to put a number on that and quantify that.
But I see that problem.
Difficult.
That I see that everywhere. But like, so like football, you can be a millionaire in senior sport as soon as it goes to youth level, or even if it is in senior sport, if it goes down the leads, that income drops, considerably. And I suppose people are so expendable that there's always, and this is where I think, and it resonates with me what you say around the short termism, and probably also, and this isn't as a slight to any coach, so I think this is about understanding sometimes about where, yeah, we can have autonomy support conversations and where actually we need to just, a lot of coaching's heuristics. It's about operating within what we can do and what we need to do at the time. And if we are combining the fact that there's limited time and space, I suppose, to chat to players, and I know one of the findings of your work that maybe we can start to touch on is where there was a more directive approach to coaching. I can see that in two levels, and I certainly, because we need to see it as understanding how to work within the time that they've got. Also, um, probably there's elements of the need for the coach to be seen as coaching because they almost need to justify their position because they're already in quite a niche in a very sought after position. So again, they're highly expendable. People could replace them. So there's these combination of factors that will always play a role in why ultimately there's a certain pedagogy in action. I mean, my PhD was all around influences on coach behaviours, and these things just happen. These, behaviours just so complicated in that respect, and I think that must be a very difficult aspect. There's also, again, just the pragmatics of in those small moments where there's not a lot of time, you can't afford to then ask questions too much. There has to be a little bit of
Yeah.
tell, and the players will want that. And then, so I see a lot of that sort of stuff happening. Just that I don't think that's constrained to just esports,
Right.
Matthew. I think that's everywhere. It's just a common issue we've got in coaching, isn't it? Again, it's like it's back and forward all the time. It's like sometimes it's because we need to, sometimes it's because we think it's the right thing to do as well. So, insofar as the interpersonal outcomes attached to that sort of wider environmental impact, so one of the things as well, you mentioned a point, and I think it's really interesting because see when you mentioned that the players sometimes will go and log on it in the different accounts, I think there's a real richness to this kind of anonymity or at
Yeah.
least the space in which there's less pressure and players can just be empowered to be free. So I see this a lot. We talk a lot about sort of deliberate play, and in football coaching we talk a lot about this. And I don't think people, insofar as like if I want to really translate what is far easier to maybe coordinate and allow for in esports coaching into coaching, just it's like organized sport doesn't happen on the streets a lot. So organized sport, there's always an eye of an adult, even if in youth sport, or the eye of a coach if it's in senior sports. And I can imagine if we want to, because in order to elicit some of the benefits you've just mentioned there, to give them a break, to let them really experiment, because I think there's a real hypocrisy, I think, where we ask our athletes and to try solutions and to not be afraid of making mistakes, but we're still in front of them, judging them the whole
Yeah.
time, and like that, it's just a con to make the athlete, try and believe that you're not judging them and that you're just.
Right.
And don't get me wrong, there is a lot of well-intentioned coaches that are going to be able to say, and they won't try and necessarily hit athletes over the head for this if they do make mistakes in these moments or they do act in a way that they wouldn't have necessarily thought they would. There is coaches that will do it, but it's always to a point, like because you just naturally, you're never going to get truly free, and uninhibited behaviour unless I think as coaches we're radical in the way we actually approach things like deliberate play.
Mhm.
Like I'm always an assumption. See if you're doing trust players, they have a bit of time before the real practice starts to go and play. Don't be outside watching them. Just go in the building. Like generally leave them alone. Like literally, don't be in the environment. Similarly, like there's spaces. And again, my main reference points is always from youth sport, just to, that's kind of where I operate. Um, you've got now clubs more and more wanting to control athletes' downtime, I suppose, or control their outside play, and like to the point where you now have the sort of proliferation of like performance skills, where like kids are they're in, they're given extra opportunity to play outside. Well, it should be outside of the club's gaze, and actually, really, what I think is really helpful is where governing bodies have set up performance drills where that player who isn't necessarily who's in an academy for that space of time inside their school day, they can actually be in a space where they're playing and it's with players of similar level, and there's a competitive element, but it can be fun and it doesn't need to always be under the prying eyes of their coach. But now there's more of a privatisation aspect to it now, where clubs want to have their own performance drills, and I think it can be good in one level but problematic in another. But you're making me think of all those things, because I think it comes down to we need as coaches to offer real privacy for players to fully authentically experiment and to down sort of for lack of a better word, I suppose, to have downtime, that sort of time, that they can be in their sport. I could imagine, does that also play a really important role in ensuring the athlete continues to love gaming as well? Because that would have been what initially brought them there, was that intrinsic love for the
Yeah.
game. So is that another reason why they're useful, probably, for coaches to accommodate the anonymous offline, whatever you might want to call it, sessions where the players are just playing?
Yeah, I think on the surface there's a lot of sense in what you're saying. The point at which I might lose a lot of friends in the world of esports is playing games isn't necessarily by itself fantastically healthy,
Mm,
and
mm,
maybe yeah, again, not making many friends in the world of esports, but like how many hours per day do we want young people just playing the game,
mm,
considering that it's largely sedentary behavior and the game modes that they play by themselves aren't really promoting or realizing these pro-social behaviors that we like to
mm,
say are a
mm,
consequence of esports. So it's double-edged sword, I think. I think yes,
mm,
if players feel like they can, create these other accounts and use those as a way of experimenting and learning and developing new skills to use in their team environment, that's one thing that probably has a performance benefit. But the downside is you then eat up more of their time playing the game, and they're
that's true.
already almost across the board, semi-professional and professional levels, you're already having training sessions that last 5, 6 hours. You're
Really?
doing that four or
Jeez.
five times a week, and then you have a couple of
Oof.
competitive days. So the it's
And
not
not all these
uncommon.
athletes, I'm going to assume not all these athletes are going to be full time either.
No,
This is part time stuff, isn't it? This is probably the majority of it part time.
yeah,
Yeah.
I
So
did a with colleagues, Callum Abbott and Dr. Phil Birch. We did a qualitative paper interviewing semi-professional and professional League of Legends players about their training. And the paper was called Perceptions of Training Effectiveness in League of Legends. And it was one of the players, and this was echoed in the other interviews, but one of the players put it very clearly that he had a full-time job during the week, and he would come home from work, immediately log on to his semi-professional team's training to play 5 games, and the games last 35 minutes to an hour
mm,
each, with the review of 15 minutes, which is generally accepted. That's where the coach has their say.
mm,
And so this person was having a full day of work, then had 5 to 6 hours of training, and training in the form of sedentary, desk-based,
mm,
screen-based activity,
mm,
and had to sustain that whilst winning and maintaining a game rank to get a shot at moving up a league to make it financially viable.
mm,
And this was this person's life for months on end every year,
mm,
and it was very quickly got to the point where this player and others realized that they used the expression that it's a grind, and
mm,
it doesn't match up with the what I think has caught the headlines in that esports is this counterculture social phenomenon that is positive, healthy, and connects young people across cultures. It's
mm,
not. it has underlying challenges, I think, because of
Yeah.
everything I've just said.
Yeah, I've not completely agree. No, it's a great point to make, actually. And it does sound so. I mean, it's interesting because we always talk in, I suppose you want to say a more physical sport,
Yeah,
that we always talk about. We actually want to allow space for athletes to detach mentally and more have opportunity to detach from the physical activity
right.
and more focus on their health and well-being mentally and other aspects, if it's social time or whatever. Um, or just maybe just having downtime in a different way. But it's funny because now we're seeing esports coaches are the same challenge, but it's different because they actually maybe are trying to find ways to help their athletes detach into more physical
Yeah,
downtime,
yeah,
so there's that aspect. And it must be different. And it is interesting because people will argue about that also in a more mainstream physical sport about what actually looking after health and well-being means. And I think it's just that it, it's quite a fluid thing. And I suppose it's highly contextual as well. But because one of the things I would say there again, and I think you mentioned at the end, and but quite importantly, I think you caveated it because it is a bit of a rhetoric that there's a counterclaim that esports is actually sociable because to some extent it is, and some people do find really meaningful connections in an online space. Some
yes.
people do find self-esteem coming from being good at a game. Some people do find autonomy in a digital world that they don't necessarily find in the real world, and not the real world, the physical, a more, a less the more material world, I suppose, if that's the sense. 'Cause I don't, certainly in the age we're at, I think the real world's becoming a more and more difficult thing to describe because
True.
there's the digital aspect of that's part of the human condition now is digital. So
Yeah,
um, but like it is actually quite a respect that you're willing to actually say that because that is that's true to a point, but there are unhealthy aspects, there's sedentary aspects to this. So, but I just think it's a nice lesson, I suppose, not just for esports coaches, but for coaches to always be mindful about that
yeah,
holistic profile of their player, I suppose, and what they need. And I don't think, and actually, I think it's an impediment to coaching performance and commitment in a sport to have them do everything that's just, they have to live and breathe it. I think you actually do need to give space for people to recharge so that when they go into your sport, they're doing it consciously with the love and the engagement that you want to see in it rather than it's another day and it's another, you said that word grind, isn't it? I
yeah,
wonder, it's just fun to speculate. I do wonder, however, like with like the advancements of technology in the future in terms of like virtual reality where there can be more physical movement. I wonder how esports is going to, and therefore the coaching of these sports, how that might become to evolve as well. It'll be quite an interesting space probably in the future because these kind of arguments were happening will become different as well because there might be more physical output, starting to come into esports, um, that kind of aligns with that. So no, I mean that's really really cool. I suppose there was a couple other things I wanted to kind of chat to you about. So we've kind of mentioned already around the drafting of players, the need to kind of constantly evolve with these sorts of patches and stuff like that. Actually, on that point, and I suppose this is something that I always find quite difficult, is getting the tension correct between gamesmanship, where you're staying within the rules of what can be allowed, and you're encouraging players to just understand how they can kind of take, the legal aspects of the game and use it to their advantage as best they can without it becoming cheating. But I know that that is a big issue sometimes, is it not, in esports? And I wonder how the coaches, because I think there's a lot that could be learned, and I just wonder from your own experience of working with the coaches or just interacting with this sort of community, is there anything that can be learned that maybe helps other sports coaches understand? Because like I say, we can't be with our athletes all the time, so we can't always force them to do the correct thing. And in esports, because you generally cannot be with athletes all the time in order to stop these things happening, and you don't have the visibility of being able to necessarily see them all the time to even know what they're getting up to. How 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 is that discouraging of cheating? How does that play a role in the coaching process? Is there any strategies that you've seen around that? And I suppose I wonder if it is in an autonomy way because, we can't necessarily just, if we dictate that it's a no-go, doesn't necessarily mean that people will listen, and if sometimes people rebel because they feel controlled, there's a lot of funny aspects to that. I just wonder have you had any experience with that so far?
Personally, my experience of that has been minimal, but
Mm-hmm.
that's probably primarily a result of the level at which I've worked, which has been relatively high in the world of esports. And
Mm,
as such, players are focused on getting results in the official games, which have many of the necessary protections around them.
okay.
However, esports is there is cheating is inherent in many of the or a big topic in many of the communities. So for example, it's anonymous in many respects. If you want to move your game rank up,
Mm-hmm.
you can buy an account that's at a higher level, and
Okay.
there are
Yeah.
people out there that are high level players that might advance an account to a high rank, and you can buy it and then use that for whatever you want to do with it.
Mm,
Sometimes you find an advantage in the software, a bug that you use to
yeah.
your advantage. And there have been some famous cases of people, for example, finding a certain pixel that you could stand on to get a better position to snipe someone else. And like
Yeah.
that is sort of within the fabric of esports. There are people looking to get ahead for less than
I
less than
could
perhaps
imagine that then probably requires, I suppose, for the coach, and it's like I suppose any coach as well, like your due diligence and your recruitment to one look, be able to look and perhaps not be fooled by sort of inflated profiles, because I
right.
suppose like agents, for example, that would be the equivalent of that in football or in other sports where there or other ways in which players now can put themselves or be put forward in such a light, but then until you've actually had an opportunity, and this is why I suppose beyond looking at analytics, this is why there's the human element of a performer that maybe has to be assessed as well. Until you do that, you're never going to fully know who you're going to get in the room, in the building, digitally speaking, physically, whatever. And then there's the sort of culture and how maybe a sport coach and an esport coach has to sort of really mandate what is acceptable and what's not, isn't it, in
Yeah.
that space, and allow, but not be necessarily the police, but create an environment where the players police themselves, where the players feel that it's the right thing to do and that they want to do it, not that they feel
Yeah.
forced to, because that isn't always the best for compliance. So there's a lot of psychology, I suppose, happening there, but cultural importance, within
It's
that.
it's probably one of the few times you might applaud short-termism because
Mm,
the players move teams so often that word spreads like wildfire if somebody
mm,
is not playing by the same rules as everyone else.
mm,
And that also goes for things like toxicity. So toxicity is perhaps a bigger issue in esports and gaming more generally, in that a lot of these online spaces are 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 sometimes not particularly pleasant places to be. I think
mm,
largely, and that's a problem with the internet more generally. I think there's all sorts of studies about disinhibition, saying, that the pros of disinhibition being that you might be more open to contribute to a discussion, but
mm,
the cons of anonymity being you feel protected to say perhaps
mm,
unpleasant things. And
mm,
that is a big topic, I think, in esports. And this is why,
mm,
and gaming more generally, and the internet, of course, and social media, it's not produced through esports, but it's
mm,
one of the challenges there is that if it's such a big topic and we admire esports performance, how can we use esports performance to overcome or challenge or improve the landscape more generally around toxicity?
mm,
And I think that's where, for me, the most important thing about my work and my research will be, if I have any impact at all, I would like it to be that coaches help create spaces that are promoting the right skills and pro-social
mm,
attributes, and in lessening the extent of toxicity because people want to do the right thing for other people in the space.
mm,
And ultimately, when they stop playing, what are they left with? And when they stop coaching, what are they left with? And are those things decent and honorable and going to
mm,
help those individuals and others? I think that's really important. So when it comes to cheating and toxicity, it hasn't been a big part of my experience. But I would wish that what we're trying to do with coaches is a way of making it less and less prevalent and
Yeah.
common and
And it kind
detrimental.
of, I suppose that probably speaks to why it's quite important that this field develops
Yeah.
because, and I don't think it's just for the I don't think it's just for the benefit of esport athletes. I think it's the benefit of people who are in online spaces more broadly than that.
Yes.
And I don't, I can start more locally insofar as like I know that a problem that football coaches, rugby coaches, whatever, from our mainstream sport coaching vocations, they are always going to have that issue with helping their athlete manage social media and spaces like this, where, as you say, it can be quite nasty. And I suppose being able to kind of coach them and how to detach or how to avoid or how to act morally in these spaces, like what more potent um, what more what more potent a ground in which to sort of consider those issues and consider perhaps where direct intervention can assist with it than perhaps the esport coaching
Yeah.
landscape in some way. And
Yeah.
then that we can scale that up to then talking about young kids or adults just more generally across society and like that. And I know that sounds like a stretch, but it's actually
No,
not,
no.
like when you consider that this is why this is an area that needs more research and more potential because it captures and grabs the imagination of exactly the demographic, particularly young
Yeah.
people that we need to protect. Video games are hugely attractive.
Yeah. Billions of people play games
Hmm.
and hundreds of thousands, millions compete in esports. Not maybe not millions compete, but like even viewership, billions of people watch games. I
Hmm.
think League of Legends has just ticked over 1 billion hours or 300 billion hours, like a huge number of hours watched. So it's part of our society. And if it's, there's a what's the meet people where they're at for effective interventions and things like that.
Yeah,
You've got a
yeah,
natural people gravitate towards games quite naturally, and young people,
yeah.
next generations do so
And I mean,
more
look,
than
this
any
is
other.
that, and this is also maybe a nice segue. Is another thing we talked about how people, naturally sort of gravitate towards games. But I mean, we're using that already in coaching in a
Right.
different way. So, like we
Yeah.
spoke, before we came on air about, gamification in coaching is a big thing. It's Russell Earnshaw does a lot of this from the Magic Academy, who was on a previous episode. But there's some great work by I think it's Amy Price,
Yeah.
in this space about how we can integrate like video game design principles within a
Yeah.
coaching session. I've done it personally. We teach it. I teach it in a lot of higher education environments. Teach it now alongside your TGFU, your constraint stuff, your the traditional approaches and stuff as well, because it's such an interesting and creative way of not just bringing out creativity in players, but bringing out creativity in coaches because the idea of like pauses, how that can help, stimulate discussion. It can help from a metacognitive perspective, like players pausing because they need to pause or and choosing when to speak to you, or just the very fact of formalising the learning process, call it a mission. Games are designed very cleverly in that sense. Games are the only sort of spaces in so far as like challenging people to do things again and again where they continue to want to come back. When a lot of other
Yeah.
people want to do that, it's strange. So there's so much that coaching's already learning from esports that I think esport coaching, besides just integrating within the sort of wider, world of coaching, it's again a really important area that I think coaches, sport coaches, however you want to call it, they can also take from it. So like I just think it's really exciting. Where do you think so where, and I suppose and without you needing to necessarily give us all the answers just yet, because I know you're still in the middle of your PhD, Matthew, but your PhD is now taking this forward now to now actually trying to figure out a little bit more about what constitutes effective esports coaching. I know your initial paper, 2022 paper, has sort of gleaned some aspects of it and maybe looked at, in some ways, the problems in esports coaching and the gaps that we need to fill through further research. And I think that's what makes it really important. But how is your PhD research extended that initial work, and where is it going to maybe go to? You feel in the maybe the months and years ahead?
Um, how is it extended? So yeah, I'm
It doesn't need to. Sometimes it's just a hot topic and it's about actually just replicating but getting more evidence. So I don't know if that's even, part
I
of that.
think I think I've uncovered more questions, which is
Yeah, that's it.
uh
That's
yeah,
the
not sure.
annoying aspect of being a researcher, but it's the important part. Yeah.
More known unknowns. I suppose that's a good
Yeah.
thing. And yeah, I think what I'm currently my pathway is at first I wanted to uncover a bit about what it is to be a coach in esports, what is the experience, and what is done. And I think through research with colleagues and through a couple of case studies and through my own practice working with coaches and trying to develop teams, I have a reasonably good handle on what it means to be a coach in esports in a select handful of games. Although I think the general pattern is, as identified in the first theme of my 2022 paper, that to date, coaches don't develop along a codified pathway.
Mm,
There aren't standardized qualifications for coaching in esports. We have tried to develop things like that as a support structure in the past. They weren't universally accepted or embraced. And that, I get it. I understand why. You know, esports is somewhat counterculture, and there is an entrepreneurial spirit in there, and people
mm,
want to uh, make it themselves by virtue of their own efforts, and that will take significant work to change if we would even think there's merit to changing it. But I think providing support for coach development is an interesting space or an interesting exercise in esports, how that might be done. But we know that the coaches, what I really admire about coaches in esports is that despite having no support, no formal pathway or structure to follow, they still strive to do it, and they do often a great job. And
mm,
they have this passion. They have a very clear why. I love the game. I want to stay connected to it. I want to help others enjoy it and thrive in the game as much as I have, or more, because it's not always the case that they were professional players. And I love that about coaching in esports. I love the fact that there is nothing to go on, so that it's figuring out as you go along. And yes, there are, of course, aspects to that which are probably detrimental in that trial and error
mm,
only takes you so far without the error being a bit worse than it should be. But
mm,
ultimately, it's an entrepreneurial spirit amongst the coaches that I think is admirable. It's a hunger to learn, but I can't say with any confidence right now what the coaches do need to learn and how they need to learn it to be better at the game, at coaching the game.
mm,
However,
mm,
I think the work of sort of Wade Gilbert and colleague Sean Cote around the need for different areas of knowledge, interpersonal knowledge,
mm,
professional knowledge, that applies. Within that, there are maybe nuances. So digital skills are essential. Um, More of an understanding of the non-verbal side of coaching,
mm,
how to make up for the fact that there is an absence of work on physical and technical in esports. It's much more interpersonal and strategic and maybe tactical
mm,
level knowledge. So, like, how do we develop that? I'm not there yet, but that's the end of my PhD will be an intervention around training coaches. And
mm,
at the moment, I'm looking at something along the lines of a community of practice where I acknowledge I don't have the answers, but maybe a community can come together to reflect on
mm,
challenges and solve problems. That probably is the end of my PhD.
mm,
Right now, I'm in a point where I'm still trying to articulate what is effective coaching and what is good coaching. So um, there is a sort of model of coaching effectiveness where you can't judge a coach in isolation by what they know. You have to also look at what the outcomes in the athlete is, in the player is. So confidence, connection,
mm,
character, etc. And I'm applying that in my current survey study. So I'm trying to look at what we consider good coaching to be in esports, and I hope the results of this will show us what might be crucial to work on in a later developmental setting. I suspect it might be game knowledge is important. So you do have to study, you have to be a student of the game that you are in. I hope there might be some transferable skills that are highlighted
mhm,
as relevant. And
mm.
without doubt, I'm sure there will be an interpersonal and an intrapersonal aspect.
Yeah, it's interesting that what you say there because again, it is a bit of a double-edged sword, I suppose, where esport coaching is currently because there's a there's that aspect of right, there's a bit of a Wild West aspect right now because there's not maybe a whole lot of structuring and no sort of established pathway for development and I suppose no established sort of body of governance for ensuring maybe practice is being not just healthy, but I suppose just in terms of just giving structure to the coaches, so it's for different reasons. But at the same time, it's in quite an interesting space, and I think even as an observer from the outside looking in, not as if I'm in a zoo ogling at something alien, but actually in a way of um, it's a very blank canvas, and I think what we have seen a lot in other more established coaching vocations is the reproduction of knowledge in in a very just cloned way that isn't really that innovative, and I think what we always have had to scratch for, and almost feel like we're searching in the dark for, is means of finding what the actual modern coaching can be in this space. So what I also kind of spin it a little bit and think what I think is quite interesting, why I'm definitely be observing the development of esports coaching through really important work like yourself, Matt, would be that it doesn't know, it doesn't have perhaps these other to some it's helpful factors, but to others it's polluting factors that they can maybe force them to act in a way that doesn't maybe that is more making it a buy-on or an add-on of other sports where it's its own thing, and sometimes there's a lot of benefit just to have a space where you can be yourself in different ways, and coaches in an ad hoc fashion. I know that was one of the sort of findings of this sort of idea of it's uncodified as such, that coaches can come across new ways of doing things, and I would, and particularly I think for any of our listeners that are certainly working in like remote coaching spaces, like this is definitely a space to watch, I think, because it could learn about how coaches can be better in a digital sphere.
Yeah, if
And
just to interrupt,
yeah.
sorry, I have to maybe shout out a colleague of mine, Kabir Bubna, who's just started a PhD down at Queensland University of Technology in
Mhm.
Australia. He's we worked together for a number of years, and he's applied. He's very much from the constraints-led coaching approach sort of
Mhm.
world, and he acknowledging how representative typical training is now in League of Legends, for example. He's been applying some very innovative constraints to how players train. So, for example, five players are sharing a voice channel via a microphone and a headset. He might apply a constraint that for a portion of the game, only one person might be able to speak. And what's interesting is what that brings to the awareness of the team in respect to how do we use communication and why is it important and what needs to be communicated, for example. So there
Mhm.
are, he's doing some really innovative work on that, but that has come around because of there is a bit of a void in coaching practice where they're not working on physical skills quite so much. So it's
Yeah.
just really interesting to know what coaches fill that space with. So
Yeah, it's like
exactly as you
it's
were
like
saying.
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of stuff like by like Chris Howard, that it's sort of like psychosocial training, but how we can integrate sort of like conversations about the mental side of the game into practices that
Yeah.
still have a technical folk, but they're still orientated towards more classic definitions of skill insofar as their performance and what they're doing in this, and maybe in this space with the joystick. But there's a social education happening there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Plus, I mean, look at it as well. Like we never know where even coaching it has done in a physical realm where it has to be moved online if it's not a short fit. Sometimes, I mean, COVID taught us about
Yeah.
that, and there was a lot of clubs that all of a sudden had to do training, the Zoom calls and these
Yeah.
things. And
Home
I mean,
workouts.
hopefully, God forbid, we need that ever happens again in that sort of space, and where it wasn't voluntary, um, similar episodes, or even where it can be an online session can be done not just it needs to be, but because coaches maybe want to do it. Again, this is where we can pull from learning that might be cultivated within an esports space. So I think it's really fascinating, Matthew. I think and I'll try my best now to sort of summarize some of what we've said without
Yeah.
butchering it too much, but we've certainly looked at sort of like the evolution of kind of esports coaching today, and I think importantly sort of distinguished what it is and what it isn't, but I think importantly more showing the real credibility of it as being just another coaching vocation, or discipline within coaching. I actually don't think it's that important beyond just stubborn people, try to convince stubborn people to listen to this, to need to necessarily go in too much about what it isn't, because we've just spoke for the last hour and a half here about coaching problems.
Right.
I have them in foot, so
True.
that's we're just doing the same thing.
Yeah.
But we've also, I think, maybe brought in some quite interesting areas as well of sort of remote coaching and where in the absence of certain luxuries and that we might get in more physical meetings with our players, how can coaches still operate efficiently there? And then, another signpost, I suppose, to coach education and the development needs of meeting the different demands of different sports that are constantly evolving and what better ground, I suppose, to consider the need for constant innovation and evolution of thought and practice than esports coaching. So it's it's been a real joy. I don't know if there's anything that we've missed, Matthew, that you want to add in just now, or if you feel we've covered most things there.
I think we've covered it all quite fairly and in great depth, and it's been fantastic. You've articulated and phrased many of the questions far better than I could have done. So that's been really great to get another set of eyes on things.
Yeah.
And it's more, as you say, I think it's another area in which coaching it's another coaching context, and there are different constraints which force adaptations in other ways. I think that's interesting, and I would just invite your listeners to, if they're not already, to think about it, because it's at a point where I think coaching knowledge is ready to take a step forward in esports, and I'd be really excited to see that happen. I'm absolutely no expert in it yet, but I've uncovered a lot of unknowns and questions, and I'm really keen for them to maybe not find answers, but to be better understood how we might go about solving these things. So
yeah, absolutely. No, Matthew, thanks so much for your contributions today. I absolutely loved that. Thanks also for those that are listening. I hope you found this conversation as interesting and it's maybe challenged you to open your mind up to learning from different sports, despite what might seem on the outside to be massive differences. I think what we've actually scratched beneath the surface enough to discover is there are many more similarities and differences, and I think we need to value that. So thanks for listening, everyone, and I will see you next time.